Hello to everyone. I am so pleased to be here. My name is Dr. Stephanie Edwards, and I am the Executive Director of the Boston Theological Interreligious Consortium, better known as the BTI. And we are just tickled to have our first of the BTI book talks this year be with one of our partners in, I was going to say crime, but it's not crime. It's something so much better. Um, we are having one of our partners who is not only a professional in her own right, but with the BTI as a BTI alum, Roz Heffitz, and we're so excited to have you. Roz brings her deep and wonderful commitment to psychology to us today, as well as her pursuit of interreligious theological education. I'm going to have her talk more about herself because I believe that's a more beautiful way to have someone share themselves with us. But I personally want to say that meeting Roz through this connection has just already borne such fruit for myself. And I hope that our time together today, we can learn not only about Roz and her individual work, but also her work with our students in the BTI and how we all might take her learnings into the world and into our own professional practice, however that might express itself. Just a little housekeeping. You do have chat enabled here. We are recording this for use on our YouTube page. So we'll send out that link so you can view it after and revisit some of the gems I'm sure that Roz has to offer. And I would also like to note that if at any time you have a clarifying question or inquiry, please don't hesitate to put that in the chat, but we will also open up times for specific Q&A at the end. So to start our conversation, because I believe personal storytelling is one of the ways in which we connect across difference, I would invite you, Roz, to share a little bit about who you are and how you come to us today.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. What a lovely introduction. I'm basking in it just at this moment. So I want to tell you a bit about my journey. This is a slice of a journey because I've been living for a while. And I'm focusing it primarily on my journey with God, although I also come with 4 children who are grown, biological children, 6 stepchildren, and 22 grandchildren coming into my life through these 10 children. So I'm not just talking with God, I'm talking with all of them too. But I've been talking with God, and in my way, God's been talking to me since I was an adolescent. It wasn't a particularly examined conversation. I called God, God, and I have other words for God at this point in my life. Eventually, after I finished college, I entered training I majored in psychology in college. I entered training, though, to become a psychologist. I wanted to be a clinician. But the complexity of my training, and this was in the late 60s, is that the training required by the demands of the institution, I won't name it so I can speak ill of it, it demanded leaving all religious spiritual matters outside the consultation room. I couldn't bring it up in supervision. I certainly wasn't given any tools to know how to work with it within the clinical room. And it's important to me to only offer what I know something about. So we were to diagnose, identify psychological strengths and weaknesses, take the patient's capacity into account, but I wasn't satisfied. I wanted more inclusion of the worlds my patients inhabited. Over time, I acquired all kinds of tools, except in the area of religion and spirituality. But after some years, many years, I had a personal crisis which challenged my relationship with God. And that was complicated because I didn't want to let go of God. And it wasn't clear to me what God wanted from me or to me or any of that stuff, but it was clear to me that I hadn't nuanced it the way I had nuanced all kinds of other things. So in order to work that out, and for other reasons, I got some personal therapy. And that was very good in dealing with the crisis I was dealing with in my personal life, but there was not one tool. But I forged on, continued my work as a psychologist. And eventually in 1998, I had the opportunity to do a full unit of CPE at Mass General. And I named Mass General only because they were the first place around here to open CPE training to healthcare professionals, which is what I was. I was on the faculty of Tufts Medical School and providing therapy at the floating hospital. CPE taught me the power of accompaniment. So that was the first step in my nuancing, that God was accompanying me, I was accompanying other people. But and it also taught me, I should put this, it also taught me that I didn't have to fix everything, that accompany meant caring, but not necessarily caring for. And probably I was able to maintain myself as a clinician up to 2 years ago. And I only stopped at that point because I wanted to devote more energy to spiritual direction. But it wasn't enough to do CPE training. Me being me, I needed an intellectual framework. And I went to Boston University. I got a master's degree in theology, specializing in practical theology, which I understand is the application of theological principles to everyday life. I know there's a fancier way to say it. But while I was in this program, I learned about spiritual direction. And it was outside of anything I had ever experienced, but it intrigued me. And at that very same time, so I think God's fine hand was in it, for the very first time, there was going to be a training program offered, not here in Massachusetts, but in New York, but it was one of these commuter programs where you could be trained as a spiritual director. So I applied for it, and I got into some difficulty in the application. I still think it's a miracle I got in, because I couldn't tell them what spiritual direction was. I didn't know. I'd never been in direction. I just felt I needed to go and do this. I did it. Between CPE and spiritual direction training, I now had tools. I could use some of them with my patients, some with myself, but I felt drawn to give, to make use of this. It's the idea of you see one, you learn one, and you give one. I know there's a better, fancier way of saying that, but that's what it felt like to me. So I started paying attention to see whether there was a place that needed me. And at that same time, one of my children was in rabbinical school, and one of my children was getting a graduate degree in Jewish education at a rabbinical school. And I began curious about what happens to rabbis, who helps them recognize how important it is to be nourishing one's own spiritual spirit. And I thought spiritual direction had something to say. So longer story shorter, I decided to take my training and begin to offer it in the Jewish community. And I've never found another person identified as a Jewish spiritual director in 2003 when I started to do this. And I developed a way, standing on the shoulders of some fabulous Christian spiritual directors, the principal one being Sister Rosemary Doherty. I developed a somewhat different approach to doing group spiritual direction. And that's what I do. It was a tough sell within the Jewish community, because first I had to explain what spiritual direction was. Then I had to kind of wade through different people's concerns about whether it was Jewish to do this. And since I don't have those limits, thanks to the parents that I have, I want to close with giving tribute to my parents. Why? Because they were very clear when I was growing up that they were going to transmit to me and to my sisters what they took from what their parents had handed to them about what Judaism is, what it can be for a person, providing both intellectual and experiential opportunities. But, and here's the gift, but they expected that my sisters and I would find our own ways of living this. And that was our job. But we always had to remember that we were not the only people in the world. And they encouraged us to be aware of how other people looked at religion, engaged with religion, or didn't, and feel at home with that too. My story.
That's beautiful. That's so beautiful. And what a gift, right, that they gave you to be able to do that discernment on your own. I would love, before we dive into the particularity of the interreligious spiritual direction that you've developed, I'd love if you talked a little bit about those early days of forming an effort in a community to which that way of speaking and way of being was quite new. I think a lot of people who come into graduate education, honestly, at any stage of their career, do so because they feel a deep call to offer some sort of rejuvenation, some sort of newness, some sort of extension of their gifts, their particular gifts, in whatever tradition or traditions that they find themselves. And I can imagine, although I do not know, that those early days in translation, let's call it, were quite formative for you to get where we will speak of later, of where you are now. So just a small reflection on that experience, and any reflections now, having it be, almost 20 years ago, about what it means to take new gifts into a community and attempt to offer some change, right? Some newness, something else that they may not have considered.
Well, again, it's somewhat of a challenging question, but I'll free associate to it because I think that's kind of fun to do. The first thing is that I've always been in the forefront of things. Just as an example, I mean, not when I was a child necessarily, but later, let's say mid-college. When I was in college, I went to college knowing that I wanted to be a psychologist. That is a longer story, and it really isn't so necessary to answer your question. But while I was there was a challenge having to do with women. I'm talking in the 60s, where who got the limited slots and who got the limited funding for graduate school. And I wanted one of them. And it turned out that I was the only woman in my graduate school class. And that's important because professors didn't know what to do with me exactly. My peers didn't know what to do with me exactly. And I needed to deal with my own discomfort of not being 100% welcome. And at the time, that was very uncomfortable. But I think it was a seed. I did it. I mean, I did it. I got all the way through to a doctorate, and I did it well. But there was both the recognition that it can be uncomfortable, but the recognition also that if you really believe strongly in something, you may have to modify your technique, but you don't have to modify your sense of purpose. And so that's the beginning. And it carried through when eventually, I'm skipping over a few parts of my career track, I got to Tufts, where I was able to, I obtained a position to develop a new program. And at Tufts at that time, no disrespect, but maybe a little implied, PhDs did not have those opportunities. MDs did. I was in the clinical setting. MDs did who were male. So again, two things, right? Nope, I had a PhD. It was a very good PhD. Thank you very much. And I was a good MD. I mean, I'm a good woman. But again, there was that same issue of how can you be in charge? You can be a clinician, but how can you be in charge of something? What do you know? And so it turned out I knew stuff, and I had to keep growing in that. All right, so this has happened again and again and again. So by the time I got to this, I relied on what I'd learned. What I learned was you can make a cold call to anybody to present something. And you make your points, and you accept with some degree of grace whatever they say. But if they say that they have no interest, you say, well, who do you think might be interested? And you don't leave until they give you two names. And then you say thank them for the time, you send them a thank you note, and so on. That's important. Because you don't know when you start who it is you're really supposed to be talking to about what it is you have in mind. So that was a technique. Now that's only if they said they weren't interested.
Sure.
The hard part was when they said, this is not a Jewish thing to do. And I had to develop answers to that. I couldn't just nod and leave. I had to begin to explain. But in order to do that, I needed to probe what they meant.
Mm.
And here's where being a psychologist came in handy. I was able to figure out that those who were hostile, and there weren't that many, most people just weren't interested, but the hostile ones were concerned that in some way I was going to get in the way of their job.
Mm.
If this could be done, this spiritual direction could be done without benefit of the synagogue or the study or the ways that they did things, there was some kind of threat. And I wasn't there as their psychologist, but it helped me remembering that that could be why a person did what they did, said what they said, is what I mean to say, would then mean it wasn't personal to me. So the second thing I had to learn was I'm hearing a double voice. So the second thing I had to learn was it's not about me. I've triggered or prompted something in them. Let me guess what it might be and see if I can soften it. So I began to be prepared to say, you know, I see what I do as an assistance to you, as an assistance, as a support to your intention to help your community grow in their feelings of connection to God and their affiliation with the Jewish people. And that's truth. I didn't make that up out of the air. I wasn't doing it to make nice. It was true. So I continued, and then I continued to network. And eventually I found a few people who were interested. And where they came from was the Jewish Chaplaincy Council of Massachusetts. These were people who day by day by day sat with people who were struggling. And they were curious about what it might mean to have this additional understanding of themselves to bring to the people that they sat with.
That's so important, because I think two things I'm going to take home is, first off, your observation of modifying technique but not sense of purpose. I think that that's beautiful. That is such a motivating thought for me. I'm going to chew on for a while. And also that deep sense of finding ways of communicating your collaborative spirit, where of course you're trying to offer something new, but it is within a context that you deeply value and, like you said, are attempting to support.
Right. I did think of one more thing, if I might add. I also determined that it was very important to share my credentials, not my credentials of my PhD or my postdoc or my 9 other credentials. I don't know. It was important for me to share my affiliation with Judaism, to talk about how I observed, to talk about how I studied, to talk about how I was raising my children. I needed to become a person to these people who were at times hostile, at times apprehensive, at times curious and wanting, but needed a little assistance to get where I wanted them to go. And so I had to be a person. And I think that's very important.
Yeah, it's about being deeply human. And this is a beautiful transition into my next question, which you've named actually in your own journey in spiritual direction. These words mean a lot of things to a lot of people. How do you interpret spiritual direction? What is it as an item?
It's a really good question, which I keep refining. And the most amazing thing happened yesterday, because I got I was reading a very exciting new book, and in the book, the author quoted one of my Jewish heroes, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And I would read and take seriously anything Rabbi Heschel said. But in this case, it answered a question that I have struggled with for a long time. And I think it will help me answer this question for you. An argument, and I put air quotes around the word argument because it's one in good spirit, that I often have with my spiritual director colleagues is the direction in spiritual direction the right word? And most of my colleagues, not all spiritual directors, but the colleagues that I interact with personally here in Boston, they'll say, no, it should be spiritual companion, it should be spiritual friend. And I have always said for years and years and years, like almost 2 decades, no, direction, because spiritual direction is a partnership between one person and another, or one person and a group of others, to help the seekers, the directees, be more mindful of the movements of the sacred in their everyday life. That's my definition of what it's about. And I can expand on that. But yesterday, the writer of this new book that I'm reading quoted Rabbi Heschel in his book, God in Search of Man. And here's what Rabbi Heschel said. I wrote it down so I could find a way to put it into this conversation because I'm so excited. It is impossible to grasp spirit in itself. Spirit is a direction, the turning of all beings to God, which Heschel describes as theotropism. It is always more than that and superior to, here it again, it is always more than that and superior to what we are and what we know. So now I'm back to me, I'm finished Heschel. If we are aware that as much as we want a relationship with God, however we name God, and we want to be mindful of that relationship and live into that relationship and grow that relationship and invite God to grow it with us, we have to be more mindful to when it's operating in our day-to-day life, because most of us have day-to-day life, right? We're not like the priests in the temple of long ago. We do what we do, but meanwhile, we want to be aware. And what a spiritual director does, mostly through questioning and encouraging quiet, and sometimes making an observation, is to help people become more aware, to help people notice, to celebrate with them when they do, and to grieve with them when they can't, but to accompany. I see myself as an accompanier.
I love that so much. Jonathan, did you have a question to offer at this juncture?
I don't yet, but I really like your excitement, Roz. You seem very passionate about your work, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. But I'm still just listening in.
Thanks, Jonathan. I would like to take that actually from Jonathan, because I think that's one of the reasons you and I connected is I think we're both people of passion. We take ourselves seriously in the sense that we are committed and passionate people that like to also laugh. But when you were thinking deeply about this passionate call, this accompaniment, did you immediately think of the interreligious aspect? Because I'm fascinated how, of course, you yourself pursued an interreligious education in theology, and was, when you were in this, right, we've talked about this kind of early days, early stages moment, when you started to think about the interreligious side, how did you come to that? To what purpose were you called with this passion and this explorative spirit that you have?
I think it's a developmental process, Stephanie. So I think I've come to it now. In other words, it was seeded in me by my parents. Before I left Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I grew up, I could tell, I don't remember all of it now, but I knew that, for example, there were 2 Lutheran synods alive there, and I knew the difference between them. I knew how the Episcopals observed and different from the Catholics. I knew there was a Greek Orthodox over here. How did I know? Because my parents took me to places. Or if I had a friend who was not Jewish, they encouraged me, my parents did, to join them. I went to a first communion when I was under 10 years old and was invited back, it was a good friend, invited back to the family's home. And they asked my parents' permission for the celebratory meal afterwards. And my mother said, and I come from a kosher home, and I have a kosher home. I observe the Jewish dietary laws. My mother said, it's okay, because you're joining them in the celebration. Eat the vegetables, but skip the pink meat. I mean, that's a cool gift, don't you think? I mean, it's just, so it already said the message in that for me, which is why I tell this story a lot, is because there are some parts that I can't participate in, but there are many I can, and it makes it possible for me to be human with another human, even though we have differences. And so that's what's underneath everything. But the sort of more intellectual answer to your question is that I didn't start thinking interreligious. I started by thinking various things have been given to me in a very brief period of time. In 1998, which is when I did the CPE training, there was room for it in my life. You know, I mean, my kids were all in college. I still was paying tuitions and all, but the point was I could do it. I could take a half-time leave from Tufts for a semester and do this unit. It was like a gift. When I decided maybe 18 months later that I really needed more education, my youngest child was graduating from college. I was used to paying tuitions, so why not pay another? And I was guided to go to BU by a mentor. And BU, I went for an informational meeting, and there's a point to this story. The BU said, I thought, oh, I'll just get some information and see. By the time I left that day, I'd been promised funding. Passion and surety of commitment communicated makes a big difference in how life turns out. It's just an important thing that I've learned. So I presented who I was, they presented who they were, and we were sure, in the same way that you and I were sure in an initial meeting, that there was some spark here that needed to be lit. So I go to BU. And I meet Professor Wolfteich. And I take every course she offers because somehow she was speaking to me. And one day she offered this an introductory experience to spiritual direction, and I did it. And something opened up. And then I went home and read a piece of mail that advertised this first program in a journal that I seldom ever looked at. Okay, the bottom line in all of that is I'm no mystic, but certainly God was knocking on my door. God, in how I understand God, is one who guides, one who puts blessings out there, challenges out there, doesn't challenge me as a person, but there's opportunities. And whether I see God, and sometimes I do, as a transcendent being, or I experience him as my still small voice, in this case, I experienced God as my still small voice. And my still small voice said, notice already. All this stuff's being given to you, but it's not being given to you so you can sit and fold your hands about it. You have to go do something with it. So it was hard enough to find Jewish people who'd be interested in doing this. And my commitment to interreligious work is solid, but my commitment to my people is at the bedrock of what I am. So I needed to do that first. And it took a long time. But some years ago, 2018, so it'd be 4 years ago, I became a bit more mindful of the fact that I can't do this forever, because I won't live forever, right? But I seem to have something good going on because people come and they stay. I mean, my groups go on and then new groups start and so on. So I've reached that stage that Eric Erickson and others talked about as generativity. I'm paying attention. I'm still doing what I do, but I'm also paying attention to what is my legacy. And so bottom line is I wrote a book. I mean, I didn't just write it in a day. It took a while to get up the audacity to write a book, to feel that I had something so important to share, but I did feel it. And so I wrote it. And I said in the book that I thought that the methodology that I had would be useful interreligiously. Because it always had been there in the back of my mind that I wasn't put on this earth just to do for my people alone. I'm a person in a much bigger world. So, but I'm also a researcher's daughter, and I had never really tested that. And so it just felt organic that I needed to shift at least some of my attention to determining by experience whether it was possible. Because I said something that is not on a printed page and you can pay money and you can buy my book. But the point is, I hadn't done the research to be sure. So here I am.
I would love if you would talk about the process through which you formed the groups and the ways in which you have prepared yourself and the group participants to participate in interreligious spiritual direction. I myself come from the Catholic tradition, which has a very long and storied past with spiritual direction. I myself have done it mostly from the Ignatian perspective, but that experience is so particular to my own tradition and has reflections built into it based on the particularities of my peoplehood, to use that term. And I'd be fascinated to know how you took that work you've done for, at that point, what, 12 or so years with Jewish groups, and said, here's how we're going to start the expansion from particularity to a bit more of a pluralist conversation.
So I have to take your question and turn it upside down, because from the beginning of crafting my groups, it was neutral. For example, in class, one of the things that I was most fascinated by in the work that I did with Professor Wolfteich was the process of Lectio Divina, divine reading. And I read up on it and I thought about it, because when I did the initial experience that Professor Wolfteich led, up to that point, my engagement with scripture, obviously I'm talking about the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the Talmud, all that, it was for the purpose of learning what God wanted from me, how I was to live. I'm not a halachic Jew, which means I don't follow all of the law codes in Orthodox matters, but I'm informed by them. How I move in the world is informed by them. So I wanted a process that was more neutral. I couldn't do Lectio Divina exactly as it is offered, because I felt that if I was dealing only with scripture, given that my initial population was clergy, Jewish clergy, and I quoted from, let's just say I quoted from the first book of the Bible, Genesis. I suspected, and I mean this with full respect of my clergy, that what they would remember is the last sermon they gave on whatever it is I read. And I wanted them to notice what was in their heart. So from the beginning, I didn't do it either Catholic or Jewish. I did it me. And what did I do? I chose poetry. I'm not a poet. I am not a scholar of poetry, but poets, good poets, they get to your feeling, they get to your guts, and they get to your feelings. And then what I wanted then was people to notice what was there, not what the poet meant, what was there for them. So that's the first thing, is the neutral of it. Then I am somewhat pragmatic as a person, and I'm still a psychologist when I'm designing all of this. I'm still a psychologist, even though I'm not practicing anymore. I thought, well, what is it that people could receive? Religion neutral from the beginning. What could they receive? Well, they could receive good listening, someone listening to them deeply with no agenda other than accompaniment. And what else could they do? And I'm thinking in group terms now. I'm not going to discuss individual spiritual direction. In terms of the group, they could be listened, if it's in a group, by more than one person, different ears, different sensibilities. And then what could the listener receive? The listener could receive something about other people that might touch them, but the purpose of the listening was not for the listener. It was to discern whether something came up in the listener in response to what the questioner had said, where the listener could ask a question that might help the person go deeper. So now you've got the experience of being listened to and a different experience of listening. I'm not listening to fix the speaker. I'm not listening to learn something for myself necessarily, but I'm learning how to listen in a new way. So both speaking my truth and being accompanied and witnessed in it by multiple listeners and learning how to listen, where if you will, the cognitive / emotional gifts that would be inherent in the experience. When you think about it, there was nothing particularly, I borrowed Lectio Divina and I credit it all over the place in the book. I did, and I think it's important to credit. I deeply think it's important to credit. I have a whole chapter in the book about crediting. And really, it's not, I don't call it that, but that's what it is, because I stand on the shoulders of other people. I didn't get here by myself. And it wasn't just God that got me here. People, human beings that are invested in this. So when it came time to make it be interreligious, I know that was at the heart of your question. The method works. How do I know this? Well, I at least know this with a sample of one. I had a group last year, my first time, so exciting. I was just about in tears the first meeting, with relief and gratitude that it was actually happening. And people talked openly about from where they were coming, using the method, my method, but at the same time, they listened carefully. And in order to underline listening carefully, I did establish, besides confidentiality and show up for every meeting and so on, the usual group things, I did establish one other very important rule, and I wrote it hard. And that is, I want people to speak from their own language. So just as an example, what you said in asking the question, you spoke about an Ignatius approach to spiritual direction. I happen to know what that is. I have a theology degree, thank you very much. But most people wouldn't, right? So I would want you to use Ignatian. And then I would want the members of the group, anybody who doesn't know what it is, when you finished listening respectfully first, say, would you mind clarifying what that is so I can really hear what you're saying? Or if you already know going into it, because you've met these other people and you know where they're coming from, if you already know that you're saying something that is unlikely, you can just say, would you like me to explain a minute or two about that? Or I'd like to just tell you what I mean. On the other side of it, if it's a Jewish person speaking, the person might be so used to using the word Torah, using Shabbat, using just words that, yes, they're Hebrew, but they just ripple off the tongue because it's how you live. Even when I used the word keeping kosher before, maybe somebody out there among our listeners has no idea what I'm talking about. But if I were in a group with them, I would give them 3 sentences about that. So that was my ground rule for making it interreligious. And one of the blessings that I got to experience in last year's group was one day, remember it was still COVID, we did that group hybrid, we did that group with masks, we did that group outdoors, we did it in every way possible. And somebody said, oh, my prayer life, since I've been stuck in my house, I can barely pray. And a person of another tradition said, I know, I'm having trouble too. Here's something I tried that was helpful to me. And spoke about it for a few minutes. The other person said, oh, interesting. A month later, we convene again. And the person who received the advice, but the person didn't say, you try this. She just said, this is something I do. She shared a bit of herself. That's important. She wasn't trying to fix the other person. The person said, I have to thank you. And the first person, I don't think actually even remembering every minute of the other thing, said, well, you're welcome, but for what? And the person said, I tried what you did and I was back in touch and I've been doing it. That's a blessing. And that's something that can come out of interreligious work. It doesn't change and who the person is essentially, but it's a sharing of tools.
I love that so much. And I think this is actually a beautiful segue. I think that for those of us who've had the gift of being in interreligious spaces, part of it is a shared realization that there's, like you were talking about, a universal translation that can happen across difference. But I would also, Monica offered this beautiful question to us. In your reflection now, doing interreligious work, what would you perceive are the limits, if any? And second part of her question, you've spoken eloquently about the role of God in this process. Is there room for those for whom God is not central or not present in their religious life? Or is that in and of itself a limit to the interreligious utility of your approach?
Do the first part of the question again. I'm sorry, I've got the second. Do the first part.
Simply to reflect on any limits that
Ah,
you've encountered.
Okay,
along.
limits plus God is a limit. Um, hmm. I'm gonna take the second half first. I interview each person coming in, and I have some sense of where they are in their religious observance and so on. But the most important thing is that groups like this are self-selective. And so it might be interesting to convene a group, and knowing that that God is not necessarily the central force animating that person's meaning-making system, to modify my own language. I don't necessarily talk God all the time in groups because I don't think it's appropriate, because I use the word God. You haven't asked me about this yet, but I think this is where it should come in. In the book, I write about, because it's what I believe, that the word God can be a space or placeholder for a movable feast of names for God, for a shifting. The word God is elastic. One can put in all kinds of metaphors. It depends if one is doing liturgy, where one might want to use a certain word for God because people have always used that word for God. That word might even be God. But the point is, they've always used it. It's in the prayer book. It's already, burned into their heart. So fine, they should use that word. But sometimes in personal prayer, that may not be the word that they use. And sometimes when they're thinking about an animating force or a divine source of energy, or as one of my directees said many years ago, the great whatever, they might do it differently. Because what we're talking about is, what is it that knowing that we're here only for a short time, that makes it possible for us to find meaning in the lives that we have? That's a lot of words for what I summarize as God. I mean, God's teachings, God, but you don't have to have a belief in God. You can be outrightly atheistic, agnostic on the topic, and you still have an animating spirit. You don't have to worry about where it came from or where it's going to go. You don't have to feel that you're being ordered to do something. But I think it's a human, it is somehow embedded in us to be people who make meaning. I think it's the thing that we have. I mean, a dog feels pain. A dog is able to give affection. A dog requires sustenance. A dog requires care. I happen to love dogs, so I'm using dog as an example. I don't have any data yet that a dog has a meaning-making system that is above that. Although I am more and more impressed with a dog's capacity to know where another person is, where a person is. So I'm a little hesitant there to say a dog does not have a meaning-making system, but I have never met a person who doesn't. I may not be able to identify with their meaning-making system, but they have one. So I don't worry about the not God part. And I think that the way I do the work, where I would have to make a change in the work, is that I might, in the questions I ask, there are 4 parts to a group spiritual direction meeting. There's like an opening, well, people check in with each other. There's a little bit of connecting time, but I might offer either a quote or a question. Later, I will do a piece of poetry. Later, I will do a piece of liturgy, not to pray over it, but to see how it sits. In an interreligious group, I'm working more or less with Psalms at this point. I didn't, and I'll get that. That's going to give me my transition to the first part of the question. I wasn't sure how to do that. And then there'll be maybe another question. Like, what is the challenge that you anticipate facing over the next month? Not a personal challenge so much, but a challenge having to do with your spirit. In each of those 4 elements, there is an opportunity for contemplation. I will ask the question, read the poem, do whatever it is I do. And all persons are invited to sit quiet until they've had enough quiet. And they indicate that by whatever convention the group has agreed to. And then one by one, they say what has come up in them in response to what I've presented. And there is quiet. And then there's an opportunity for anyone who has a question to further their discernment, the discernment of the speaker, to ask. And we go through that again. We use that same process for all 4 parts. And sometimes there's so much to be said in the first 2 parts or 3 parts, we don't get to the 4th part. So I save it for the next month. It's perfectly okay. What is the limit so far in interreligious groups? The limit is me. Me meaning I am not going to offer what I don't understand. So one of my goals for this year that you've been very helpful about was to meet some Muslim people who might be willing to read my book, who might be willing to have a conversation with me about, would this fly within that tradition? I don't know. And until I have a better sense from those who are in it, I wouldn't do it. So the limit to this opportunity so far is really an ethical one, my ethics. And it's on that principle of you don't offer before you have engaged with the people you want to offer to.
I think that is so deeply important for the people in the room that I have not met. I am a dual professional. I also hold a degree in social work and have practiced in the past, and something I'm sure, unfortunately, Roz has seen in her long work history is many of us in the caring professions being asked to do things that potentially we are not qualified to do, and we potentially do not feel comfortable doing because of that lack of preparation. And sometimes that comes out of sheer need. And sometimes that's because there is a small, still voice within us that says there's something here. And for someone like myself, me, might rush to do before I have done the proper self work and proper self construction to do that work well. Because I think a lot of our culture says, hey, problem, go fix. And of course, Roz can, and all of us here can say, yeah, we need more interreligious relationship, not access, not movies, relationship. And so those of us here might say, oh, great, I have Roz's book. Done and dusted. I can leave here and go do my thing, but I say this only to reflect back to you what I think is such an important lesson from your long career is to say, take the time to do the work well, as opposed to, and I think this goes to Monica's question, sadly, you may want to rush, but then you would potentially create a situation that is not helpful. And in social work, and I know in psychology, we also speak of unfortunate harm that the caregiver or the space provider can do when they really mean to do well. So before we close, I thought that I would simply offer Roz the space in our last 5 minutes to give us a reflection upon her work as it is currently that we have not had space for yet in the flow of our conversation, that you would want our current students, our alums, our community to take with them about this work. I offer this because I hear more and more that we need this type of being with in the world. And I'd love for you just to give us whatever reflection on it that you'd like us to take away. And of course, we'll have more opportunities for connection offered at the end.
Whoa, that's a large question, and probably an hour from now, I might have an idea what to say. But I'm just going to say what comes to my heart, which is, if I've learned nothing else, and I've learned a lot in the years I've been alive, is to keep with the journey metaphor. And when I first read Robert Frost's poem, about, you want one path and not the other, there were 2 paths. And And he ends with, and that has made all the difference. And I have had in my life lots of those where I could go left, I could go right, I could go this way or that. And it hasn't always been clear to me exactly why to do it. But as long as I held fast to my truths, many of which I've expressed today, which is like, don't do what you don't know how to do, but use your voice and explain that's why, because somebody might appear is a better word than occur. Somebody might appear who could help you on the next step. So if let's say 21 years ago, or in 1995 or whatever, before I did the CPE training, if someone had said, in 2021, you're going to have a book published by Spiritual Directors International Press, I would have laughed and said, I'm not a writer. And what is the Spiritual Directors Press? And why aren't I being a psychologist? Or why haven't I retired yet? Or I don't know, I would have said all those things. But if you keep moving with some degree of intellectual grounding and faith in whatever it is that you are drawn to have faith in, and some perspective and some capacity to discern, which is to notice where you are, literally, to notice where you are physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, you make those choices among the paths. Often there are more than two, in ways that not only benefit you, but benefit those that you're called to serve.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. I want to thank you so deeply for your time and commitment, not just in this short reflection on your book, but also in forming community within the Boston Theological Consortium. It's really been a beautiful opening that I hope we will continue to grow as we continue, to your observation, to educate people in the many multitudes of meaning making that it exists within our network. It's just a beautiful place to do this work, and I'm so glad you're with us.
Thank you very much.
You're so welcome. I wanted to offer, because Roz was so gracious to let us share her email with the group. It is in the chat alongside the link to the book. I know that the BTI is more than happy to support any future collaborations or thought experiments or anything that this group or those networks with whom you are connected are inspired to offer. We are definitely excited and so thankful to have you as part of our community. So thanks for the
I appreciate it very, very, very much. Your enthusiasm and support, and this opportunity. This is an interreligious experience, and we're having it together, and it makes my heart happy.
Well, see, you know what? If we can do that on a Thursday for a lunch hour, I think that's pretty time well spent.
Me too. Me too. And I want to just say thank you to those of you who have come. You're busy people doing different things, and to use some time on when it's out for people to hear. Those of you who listen, it's exciting for me to continue to be able to share.
Well, thank you so much. And you know what, we're always growing and working together. So I know I will see all of you soon. And please leave this with our shared sense of goodwill and some meaning making being had. And we will see you at our next event. Thank you so much. Goodbye.